By the third week of August 1944, the German army in Normandy was no longer retreating. It was trying to force itself through a doorway that was already on fire. On the farm roads east of Falaise, engines stalled in the dust. Horses screamed beside overturned wagons. Tank crews abandoned machines that had no fuel left, no tracks left, or no road left to use. And above them, the Allied aircraft kept circling. This was not the slow collapse people expected from an army being pushed back mile by mile. This was something colder. Two German armies were being squeezed into a shrinking pocket of orchards, villages, and river crossings. The 7th Army. The 5th Panzer Army, the same formations that had held the Allies inside Normandy for more than 2 months, were being forced toward one narrow exit. The Germans had a name for that exit. They called it the Corridor of Death. And the strangest part is that the corridor was not made by Allied strength alone. It was made by German orders. To understand how an army that had fought so hard for every hedgerow ended up dying on roads it could not escape, you have to go back to the part of the battle that looked, for a while, like German success. For 10 weeks after D-Day, Normandy was exactly the kind of battlefield the German defenders wanted. Not open country, not tank country, hedgerow country. A maze of sunken lanes, thick banks, enclosed fields and blind corners where a rifle section could disappear into green walls and make an entire battalion pay to move another 100 yards. The Americans bled for fields outside Saint-Lô. The British and Canadians hammered at the approaches to Caen. German panzer divisions were pulled into the line wherever the danger was worst, and again they helped stop a clean Allied breakout. But a defensive victory can become a trap when the men holding the line are not allowed to leave it. By late July, the German front in Normandy still looked solid on the map. In reality, it had become a door with rusted hinges. On July 25th, the Americans kicked it in. Operation Cobra began west of Saint-Lô with one of the heaviest bombing attacks of the campaign. The target was a narrow section of German line. Inside that belt sat the Panzer Division, once one of the strongest armored formations in Normandy. After the bonds fell, Panzer was no longer a formation in the old sense. It was a broken remnant, trying to remember where its companies had been. Then the American First Army drove into the rupture. At first, German headquarters treated it as a local crisis, a hole to patch, a thrust to block, a problem that could be handled if enough reserves were thrown into the right place. But there were no reserves left that could move fast enough. Within 3 days, the western side of the German position had opened like torn cloth. Roads that had been clogged with fighting were suddenly open to American armor. The front did not bend. It split. And on August 1st, the split became a race. George Patton's Third Army came into action and did what German commanders feared most. It stopped fighting the hedgerow battle on German terms. Patton's columns surged into Brittany, then swung east across the rear of the German position. They moved fast enough to leave maps behind. They took risks with their own flanks because speed itself had become the weapon. The German high command still looked for a line. Patton was attacking the space behind the line. That was when the real decision arrived. Field Marshal Gunther von Kluge, commanding Army Group B, could see what was happening. The Allied breakout had not simply gained ground. It had opened the left side of his entire front. If the German armies in Normandy remained where they were, they could be surrounded. The professional answer was ugly, but clear. Pull back. Give up ground. Save the army before the roads east disappears. But Adolf Hitler did not want an army saved. He wanted the breakout cut off. From headquarters far from Normandy, the order came down. Attack west. Strike toward Morton. Drive through the narrow base of the American advance and sever Patton's spearheads from the rest of the Allied army. On a map, it looked bold. On the roads of Normandy, it was madness with tank tracks. The German counterattack began on August 7th. Operation Luttich gathered what armor could still be forced into motion and sent it toward Mont. The goal was to close the American breakthrough from behind. The result was that the strongest German units left in Normandy were pushed farther west, deeper into the sack, at the exact moment the Allies were moving around them from north and south. At Mortain, German armor ran into men who refused to move. American troops on Hill 314, part of the 30th Infantry Division, were cut off above the town. They were surrounded, shelled, and attacked, but they held the height and called artillery fire onto the roads below. The Germans needed that hill. They never took it. And then the weather cleared. Allied fighter bombers found German armor in daylight, on exposed roads, moving through country where concealment was almost gone. Typhoons, thunderbolts, and other Allied aircraft came down again and again, not as a single dramatic blow, but as a grinding pattern. A tank here, a half-track there, a column stalled, then hit again. The counterattack that was supposed to rescue the German position burned itself out against a hill and a sky it could not control. That was the hinge. Not the only reason the Falaise Pocket formed, but the decision that turned danger into disaster. Because while German panzers were wasting their strength around Mortain, the Allied jaws were already moving. From the north, Canadian and British forces drove south from the Caen sector toward Falaise. Operation Totalize began on the same night as the German counterattack, using armored columns in darkness to break through the defenses along the road. From the south, Patton's Americans were moving up toward Argentan. Look at the map, and the shape is simple. One arm coming down, one arm coming up. Between them, German armies still facing west, still obeying an attack order, still trying to solve a battle that had already changed shape. The mouth of the pocket was roughly 15 miles wide. Falaise on the north side, Argentan on the south side. Close that distance, and the German armies inside Normandy would have no organized road home. But the mouth did not close immediately. That delay became one of the most argued decisions of the campaign. By August 13th, Patton's troops had reached the Argentan area. His instinct was to keep moving north and slam the trap shut from below. But General Omar Bradley ordered him to halt. There were reasons, real ones. The northern Allied forces were still fighting their way down through stubborn German resistance. The battlefield was confused, full of smoke, smashed villages, shifting columns, and uncertain contact lines. Bradley feared that an American thrust too far north might collide with Canadian and Polish forces coming south, or be struck from the side by German units, still fighting with desperate strength. So the Americans stopped near Argentan. The gap stayed open, and through that gap, the Germans saw the last thing any trapped army looks for: a road out. Inside the pocket, the retreat became less like an operation and more like a stampede with staff officers. Every unit wanted the same road. Every commander wanted his men through first. Tanks mixed with ambulances, headquarters vehicles mixed with field kitchens, horse carts jammed beside self-propelled guns. Drivers tried to move at night and hide by day, but the roads were too few and the columns too large. The army had become a body, with all its bones trying to pass through the same narrow throat. That is where the Allied air power and artillery turned retreat into destruction. The exit ran through small Norman villages, open fields, orchards, and crossings over the Dive River. There were bridges, fords, and roads that looked usable on a map until thousands of vehicles tried to reach them at once. Once a column stopped, it stopped everything behind it. Once the first vehicle burned, the road became a target. Allied artillery observers watched from high ground and called fire onto the crowded routes. Shells walked along the traffic lines, bursting among men who had nowhere to scatter. Trucks caught fire. Ammunition wagons blew apart. Horses bolted into shell holes. Wounded men crawled into ditches already full of other wounded men. From the air, Allied pilots learned the geometry of the killing. Hit the front of a column, hit the rear, trap the center, then return. The Germans inside the pocket could move only by accepting loss. Move in daylight and be seen from above. Move at night and collide with everyone else trying to escape. Leave the vehicles and walk, or stay with the vehicles and burn with them. Near the Dives crossings, the retreat became almost medieval. Men abandoned trucks and waded through water under shell fire. Horses fell beside broken wagons. Guns were dragged as far as the banks, and left there when no team could pull them across. The river crossings filled with shattered wheels, packs, boots, bodies, and the drowned machinery of an army that had once been built for movement. The army was not only losing men, it was losing its body. A soldier who escapes with a rifle is alive, but an army cannot fight with rifles alone. It needs guns, radios, fuel trucks, recovery vehicles, workshops, maps, ammunition, command posts, bridges, time. At Falaise, almost all of those things were being stripped away on the road. Still, the Germans did not simply dissolve. They fought to keep the corridor open because every hour mattered. Every hour meant more men slipping out to the east. Every hour meant one more battalion could crawl away from the pocket, even if it left its guns behind. The Allies, meanwhile, tightened the ring. On August 14th, the Canadians renewed the drive south in Operation Tractable. It was not clean. It was not quick. German rearguards fought from villages, slopes, and tree lines with the stubbornness of men who understood exactly what would happen if the road closed behind them. Falaise itself fell to Canadian troops on August 16th and 17th, after hard fighting. The northern jaw had come down. The gap narrowed. 15 miles became 10. 10 became a few. And at that exact moment, the German command structure shook at the top. Von Kluge, trapped between Hitler's orders and the reality unfolding in front of him, was relieved of command. Field Marshal Walter Model took over Army Group B, a commander known for restoring broken fronts by willpower, improvisation, and ruthless urgency. But this was not a front that needed willpower. It needed a way out. Kluge began the journey back toward Germany under suspicion, disgraced and politically exposed. He did not reach home. He took poison on the road. While German soldiers were being crushed in the corridor, the command above them was changing hands and collapsing into fear. But the final lock on the pocket was not thrown by a headquarters. It was thrown from a ridge. Hill 262 rose above the escape route near Mont Ormel. To Allied maps, it was a height. To the Polish soldiers who climbed it, it became the Maxuga, the mace, because of the shape it made on the map. And in the last hours of the pocket, that ridge mattered more than almost any village. Whoever held Hill 262 could look down onto the roads the Germans needed to survive. On August 19th, the Polish 1st Armored Division, under General Stanislaw Maciek, fought onto the high ground and dug in. They were not there to make a symbolic stand. They were there because from that height, artillery observers and tank crews could see the German escape route. And what they could see, they could destroy. For the Germans, the ridge was unbearable. Inside the pocket, units trying to escape had to push past the Polish position or move under its fire. Outside the pocket, German armored forces fought inward, trying to break the Poles off the hill and reopen the road for the trapped armies. So the Polish troops were attacked from both sides. A small force on high ground, low on ammunition, low on water, with wounded men piling up and German armor pressing in close enough for point-blank fire. For 2 days, the Majuga became a separate battle inside the larger battle. German troops came up the slopes again and again. SS panzer units struck from outside the pocket. Breakout groups struck from inside it. The Poles held the crest, lost ground, regained ground, and kept firing into the corridor below. There were moments when the ridge looked certain to fall. It did not. The cost was terrible. Polish losses mounted. Their wounded could not easily be moved. Their positions were battered by artillery and armor. But as long as they held Hill 262, the German escape route remained under a killing eye. Farther down in the corridor, other fights flared around villages and road junctions. At St. Lambert, Canadian troops fought among wrecked vehicles and desperate German columns, trying to keep one last passage open. Around Chambois, American, Canadian, and Polish forces closed toward one another through smoke, confusion, and pockets of German resistance. This is where the truth of Falaise has to be held carefully. The pocket was not sealed early enough to trap every German soldier inside. Thousands escaped, probably tens of thousands. Estimates vary because the retreat had become too chaotic for neat accounting, but somewhere between 20,000 and 50,000 men managed to slip east before the corridor closed completely. That matters, because Falaise was not the annihilation of every man. It was the destruction of the army as a fighting machine. The men who got out often came out without tanks, without guns, without vehicles, without heavy equipment, without the structure that made their formations dangerous. They escaped as exhausted fragments moving toward the Seine and the German border. Behind them, the roads held what they could no longer carry. Burned-out Panthers, abandoned assault guns, towed artillery with no tractors, trucks smashed into ditches, radios left in command vehicles, field kitchens, ammunition, maps, horses, bodies. The names of the units survived on paper. The force underneath those names had been gutted. On August 21st, the pocket finally shut. The Poles were still on the Majuga. Canadian and American forces had linked around the closing gap. The corridor of death was no longer a corridor. It was a graveyard with roads running through it. When the counting began, the numbers were almost too large to hold in one picture. Roughly 80,000 to 100,000 Germans had been caught in the pocket at one point or another. Around 10,000 to 15,000 were dead. 40,000 to 50,000 became prisoners. Hundreds of tanks and assault guns were gone. Thousands of vehicles and large numbers of guns were destroyed, abandoned, or captured. The 12th SS Panzer Division, Hitlerjugend, had entered the Normandy campaign as a powerful armored formation. By the end of the pocket, it was reduced to a battered remnant, with much of its equipment left behind in the wreckage. The 7th Army's commander, Paul Hauser, escaped wounded, reportedly carried out with a severe jaw wound. The general got out. The army he commanded did not. That is the essential point. Falaise did not merely push the Germans out of Normandy. It removed the German army in the west as an organized striking force. There were still German soldiers in France. There were still headquarters. There were still flags on maps. But the divisions that had held the Allied armies for 10 weeks had lost the machines, guns, transport, and cohesion that made them divisions. After Falaise, the Allied advance changed character. The resistance in front of them became broken and uneven. The road to the Seine opened. 4 days after the pocket closed, Paris was liberated. The city did not fall because every German position in France had been carefully defeated one by one. It fell because the army that might have stood between Paris and the Allies had been wrecked in the fields around Falaise. And that is why the battle still carries a hard lesson. The German soldier in Normandy had not been weak. He had fought skillfully in the hedgerows. He had delayed a stronger enemy for weeks. He had made the Allies pay for nearly every field. But courage cannot repair a bad order, and obedience cannot turn a closing trap into an open road. Hitler ordered the army to strike west when survival required it to move east. The counterattack at Mont pushed the best remaining German armor deeper into danger. The delay in closing the gap gave thousands a chance to run, but it also funneled them into roads the Allies could see, shell, and burn. By the time the last corridor closed, the men who escaped were no longer leaving Normandy as an army. They were leaving as survivors. At Falaise, ground was not the thing Germany lost. The army was. The men who escaped walked east. The army stayed behind in the fields.